kick-started straight away. The biggest event over the weekend, the UFC in Las Vegas. It was titled as the Aussie takeover of the UFC in Vegas. We had a few Aussies on the card. We had actually 5 scheduled. We had Alex Volkanovski, Robert Whittaker, Jimmy Crew, Shannon Ross, and Jack Della. Unfortunately, Jack Della's fight was cancelled for a second time straight. But the other 4 fought. Not the best night for the Aussies. Alex Volkanovski defended his featherweight title, and he did it in sensational fashion. Robert Whittaker lost, unfortunately. I think that is pretty much the end of him. Jimmy Crew and Shannon Ross, not the best of nights. Give us your take, mate.
I thought it was a really interesting day. It's, as you said, disappointing about Robert Whittaker going down to the South African Duplessis, but Duplessis was the bigger, better fighter on the day. As we know, Volkanovski, just a supreme fighter, and Dana White, the chairman of the UFC, said as much afterwards. And he just the ability to woo the crowds, to be a great fighter, to do it in front of the man Donald Trump, the former president and the future president, and a host of other celebrities in Vegas at T-Mobile Arena was just sensational.
Absolutely. So let's look at the UFC and the relationship it's had with Australia and Australian fighters and Australian fight fans. Dana White made some interesting comments in his post-fight press conference. He said, Australia is a big market for us in terms of pay-per-view numbers. The last 3 events that they've come out to have been sold out. When Ronda Rousey fought in 2014, she sold 57,000 tickets at today's Marvel Stadium. The UFC has had amazing success in Australia. Now, all this success has come on the back of no real structure, no real pathway for fighters to pretty much say, okay, I want to become a UFC fighter. What happens now? Where do I go? And how do I end up in the UFC? There's local promotions like Hex Fight Series and a few others. Yes, but it's still very unstructured, all over the place. And a lot of these fight promotions are just drowning in losses year after year, where we see in other countries like what's happening in China, what's happening in Vegas. They built the PIs, the Performance Institute, and now they're looking to expand into other countries. But Australia, one of the core UFC audiences, really has no structure.
Yeah, but just because we have a huge PPV, a pay-per-view consumer base here in Australia and New Zealand, that doesn't mean or equates to participation. So obviously like the AFL or the NRL pathway programs, or be it tennis or soccer, they start from a very young age and it's bred into them, usually through their families and all their surroundings, whereas the UFC is a very unique and niche sport. I mean, it is enormous worldwide, we know that. But the uptake and participation is so minute, and that's either something that we have to look at or accept.
Yeah, but Tony, what we're talking about here is look at the numbers that we've seen at the last 3 events, or any event that the UFC has held in Australia. Sellout after sellout after sellout. So clearly there's an appetite for it. There's success now on the international scene with Volkanovski, with Whittaker, with Tavasu, with Mark Hunt before them. Like, there's multiple fighters that are coming out of this small country, and they're really performing on the world stage with no real pathway or infrastructure.
Yeah, but hence that goes back to my previous point. Do we want to watch it as a consumer, or do we want to participate? So that's something that either the current crop of parents or parents-to-be either wants or doesn't want. I mean, I think a lot of people, the newfound athlete is not as hard as what we've been bred in the past. I mean, if you look at AFL and NRL, the amount of clashes that the boys used to take on during a game was, almost insurmountable. It was just the body-on-body contact was rough and it was tough. And Now we have governing bodies worried about CTE and bone breakage, and our contact sports are largely becoming a lot like basketball.
Yes and no, because if you look at the gyms that are coming up, popping up left, right, and center, there's now UFC gyms, private gyms, BJJ, martial arts gyms popping up everywhere, all over the country. Now, they're not opening to just to pay rent. Their numbers are huge. There's a demand here, especially in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
But is there?
There is. Look at the numbers and see.
Well, I don't know what the numbers are.
Well, that's my point. So, if there was a structured pathway for these fighters, there's the amateur associations that have pushed these different fight leagues in the country. The MMA Amateur Association, which is previously run by a good friend of mine, Ed Bavlock. They did their part, but even then, when you talk to him, he'll tell you there's a huge lack in funding compared to other sports.
So, now, what would you like to see change?
More funding from government, more infrastructure built around these martial arts. Why is the government pulling away from martial arts? Do we want strong Australians who display Aussie character and passion on the international stage, or do we want people just to stay here and just play footy or rugby? Like, at the end of the day, when they go fight in these tournaments around the world, amongst thousands of athletes, they're holding the Australian flag. They're representing us.
They may be. Oh, look, I don't have an answer to your query. I mean, the state government has been, pretty good actually in terms of seeking those big entertainment fights that we see at Marvel Stadium. But in terms of the pathway, maybe they don't want to support that.
But the big entertainment fights is because it brings people to the state. It's tourism dollars. I mean, the Victorian state government, for God's sake, gave Netball Australia $15 million. And everyone knows that's a flop at the end of the day, whether we like it or not. That's the only way that they're looking at it. We're talking about the development of the sport that's producing these international figures. Who knew Alex Volkanovski before he fought in the UFC? Who knew Robert Whittaker before he fought in the UFC? Who knew Mark Hunt before he fought in the UFC? He used to go fight in Japan in Pride.
Well, Mark Hunt was a sort of a relative well-known person, but Chris Minns, the New South Wales Premier, has invested a lot of money and is now going to host the UFC, I think it's 293 or 5 in Sydney, September 8. So, yes, the state governments are invested because they know it's entertainment and it's huge for the tourism economy.
That's tourism dollars. We're talking about infrastructure and pathways.
Yeah, well that's not something I'm familiar with. That's more your pathway.
My conclusion is more dollars have to be invested into these pathways and these foundational programs that lead to these athletes going on to fight in the UFC and representing Australia on an international level.
Well, let's do something about it. When Dana White and his crew come to Sydney in the first week of September, let's progress that situation on behalf of Australia and New Zealand. And if potentially the next president of the United States is ringside for UFC as he was yesterday for the Australian invasion of Las Vegas, well, surely a smart politician is going to maximise that and think, well, if it's good enough for Donald Trump, it's good enough for us.
Very questionable because of once you get politics involved, it's over.
Everything's political.
Yeah, but once you start, like, for example, now I have to go down this rabbit hole. Donald Trump Jr.'s tour of Australia got cancelled. Why? Because they approved his visa one night before the event was scheduled. Right? It was sitting in the back of some log of files, and then all of a sudden, one night before, it got approved, and you had a minister on Twitter making fun of him.
Yeah, Claire O'Neill.
Yeah, as a sore loser, right? And like these tactics are what destroy countries. I don't want to go down this conversation because I want to stick to sport.
Okay.
These are the tactics that destroy countries. So anyway, we're moving away from this. We're staying on sport, and we're going to keep going. Thank you, Tony. Take care, everyone. We'll catch you all on the next episode of Raw Sports.